He was a key member of the planning committee for Sri Lanka's first 10-year plan, 1959, which sought to raise economic growth and reduce poverty. Among his numerous achievements was his appointment as the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, where he negotiated the terms of the Lome Convention, a landmark agreement providing development and access to European markets to Africa and the Caribbean. He was an early proponent of the equitable development who worked tirelessly for trade and development in developing countries. The Gamini Korea Foundation provides opportunities for meaningful economic engagement through rigorous multidisciplinary research to promote inclusive and sustainable development. The Gamini Korea Foundation, an autonomous non-profit institution, is committed to making a real and lasting difference in the lives of vulnerable people. The Sri Lanka Innovators Forum, SLIF, has been conceptualized by Gamini Korea Foundation to bring about change and infuse innovation into the processes of democratic governance and sustainable economic development. It aims to pursue in-depth research and dialogue, focusing on core sectors that need to be addressed and suggest innovative, results-oriented policy strategies to resolve the current economic crisis. The Sri Lanka Innovators Forum will bring together the like-minded thought leaders and industry stakeholders to discuss, debate and agree on pressing issues in a variety of sectors and devise alternative, sustainable economic models, processes and practices. A group of thought leaders who are also subject experts have been assigned to review the issues papers and provide necessary guidance and relevant research material to the respective authors. SLIF will transcend boundaries and barriers and invite specialists from all over the world to contribute their expert views and knowledge to enable Sri Lanka to face its current challenges effectively. 20 identified sectors have been assigned to experts to research and write issues papers on contemporary issues which have an impact on socio-economic development. The discourse will commence with questions that should be raised on good governance and administrative reforms. The other topics are tourism, export-oriented industrial development, macroeconomic policy, poverty reduction, reforming Sri Lanka's state-oriented enterprises, Sri Lanka's electricity and petroleum industry, Sri Lankan food crops, livestock and fisheries, transportation and highways, education, healthcare, shipping and logistics, international trade and investment, subnational policies, environment, women and development, ethnicity and socio-economic development, information technology, and foreign policy. The outcome of these issues papers forms a blueprint to be presented to policymakers as a landmark contribution from the Gamini Korea Foundation towards strengthening the economic recovery of Sri Lanka. You are invited to join the Sri Lanka Innovators Forum by logging on to the Gamini Korea website. Fill in the registration form, choose an area of expertise where you would like to share your knowledge, advice and comments on the issues papers posted under each thematic area. Sri Lanka Innovators Forum, beyond the barriers of tradition.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to have the pleasure of inviting our director, Professor Sirimewan Kolambage of the Gamini Korea Foundation to deliver the welcome address.
Thank you, Sohan. As already mentioned, this is the 6th session of the Sri Lanka Innovators Forum under the umbrella of the Gamini Korea Foundation. This is an initiative conceptualized by our chairman, Dr. Lloyd Fernando. Dr. Lloyd Fernando, chairman of the Gamini Korea Foundation, board directors of the Gamini Korea Foundation, Professor W.D. Lakshman, Howard Nicholas, distinguished participants and dear friends. Of course, it is a great pleasure to me to welcome you all to this important session. As you all know, Bram Nicholas is going to make a presentation on export-led industrial development. Of course, we have been having so many discussions on this particular subject over the last 45 years or so. A major objective of liberalizing the economy way back in 1977 was to promote export-led industrial development, which ultimately it was expected that we could promote export-led economic growth as well. But unfortunately, Sri Lanka has failed to achieve industry-led development as well as export-led growth for many reasons. Particularly, we had 30-year-old ethnic conflict, and we had macroeconomic instability, political instability, and recently we had the COVID-19 epidemic as well. So there were so many reasons for Sri Lanka's failure to achieve export-led industrial development or export-led growth. All in all, now we are facing a severe economic crisis. I don't have to explain, but I would like to flag two deficits. Those are called twin deficits. That is, we have a major fiscal deficit, and secondly, we have the balance of payments deficit. Of course, if Bram can show us how to develop our industrial sector, we can overcome the balance of payments difficulties and as well. And also we have a serious debt crisis which has led to default. We are on the debt default situation globally, so we are in a the situation is not so bad, but the good thing is the government has embarked on a major economic reform package under the extended fund facility of the IMF. So hopefully Sri Lanka could recover in the next few years or so. So this the objective of this particular series of presentations organized by the Gamini Korea Foundation is to facilitate the policymakers to overcome the economic crisis, current economic crisis, as already explained on the video. So we hope that Sri Lanka will recover very quickly, and we are pleased to have Professor W.D. Lakshman, Emeritus Professor and the former Governor of the Central Bank, as the chair of this session. We are thankful to you, sir, for accepting our invitation to chair this session. Now, Professor Lakshman will conduct the session as the chairman. So I would like to invite Professor Lakshman to conduct the session. Over to you, sir.
I thought you will conduct the session. Dr. Lloyd Fernando, Dr. Sirimewan Kolabagi, Dr. Howard Nicholas, Bram Nicholas, friends, ladies and gentlemen. By way of chairing this meeting, I do not expect to intervene in too many occasions in the discussions that will be going on. Let me begin by giving you a very brief historical overview of the industrialization attempts taken in this country by different governments, and then invite the two paper writers, Bram Nicholas and Dr. Howard Nicholas, to make their presentation. So to give my brief comments, before that let me congratulate Bram for taking up the broad topic of industrial development of Sri Lanka, together with Howard, who is widely known among Sri Lankan academic and business circles for his strong views about the need of an industrialization thrust to take Sri Lanka out of the developing country syndrome. I will express a few ideas of my own on the subject and will open up the room for invited discussions and participants after the presentation by Nicholases. The following is a point I wish to make at this stage. The interest of the country's policymakers in industrialization has had a history of ups and downs following political regime changes. Colonial rule led to gradual destruction of whatever industrial activity that was practiced in pre-colonial days. The first signs of an interest in manufacturing industry could be seen in the 1930s during the British rule itself, but after the grant of limited self-rule by the No More Constitution. Guided by the Executive Committee on Trade and Industry and Trade, the government tried during this period to give leadership to commence a series of industrial activities. In the absence of private enterprise prepared to undertake these industrial undertakings, the government itself decided to set them up as government departments with the hope of passing them on to private hands later. The exercise, based largely on import substitution, did not last long as prevailing trade restrictions on imports were removed by the first post-independence government, which believed in private enterprise and open trade practices. The main focus areas of the two UNP-led governments during 1946 to 56 were irrigation, land development and agriculture, including plantation agriculture. Manufacturing taking a back seat on the grounds that Sri Lanka was not yet ready to embark on the process of industrialization. We might also recollect the World Bank team and its influence in the early 1950s in setting up these ideas. India and Pakistan, which received independence around the same time as Sri Lanka, witnessed a growth of manufacturing, while Sri Lanka continued to remain largely agricultural. The second period of interest in industrialization for growth emerged after the first post-independence UNP regime, which continued into two parliamentary terms, were replaced by a left-of-center coalition in 1956, which remained in power till 1965. The adopted basic strategy of industrialization was again import substitution, helped by gradually widening import restrictions and supported by the assistance granted by countries in the socialist bloc to set up modern industrial plants in Sri Lanka. The seesaw in policy focus between industrializing and agriculture. Agriculture, later coupled also with service activities like tourism, continued. The UNP-led national government, 65 to 70, which also witnessed the emergence of IMF influence as a major force in domestic policy making. So the policy focus again moving away from manufacturing industry. The next left-of-center regime again moved back towards an emphasis on manufacturing industry. Of course, the history after 1977 is familiar to all of you, and I need not take time to review that period. Let me conclude the chairman's initial comment here. Because of wavering policy positions briefly noted above, we were not able to achieve any significant industrialization as the bedrock for successful accumulation and growth. Nicholas's have raised a few relevant issues, I hope, and let us hear what they wish to present to you as a summary of the papers. Let the invited panelists, after the writers of the paper, let the invited panelists and later members of the audience raise any issues on the subject. With those, I invite, I think the agreement is Bram, you to proceed. Bram to make his presentation and to be followed by Harvard. Okay. Thank you very much for listening to my comments. Bram, your mic.
Thank you, Professor Laxman, for starting off the session. And thank you, Gamini Korea Foundation, for hosting this event today. Truly honored to be able to present our paper. Special thanks to Dr. Lloyd, Fernando, and to all of you for being here. Also, of course, Professor Kalambage for hosting us. I am going to circle back in the end to what Professor Laxman started us off with, which is Sri Lanka's experience. But before I do that, I'm going to highlight a few key points that we found in the paper. And really what Howard and I both decided is we're going to try and avoid most of the academic stuff that we present in the paper, because we don't want to take too much of your time with that. We're more interested in the discussion afterwards. And of course, there's always the paper if we need to get into the details and the nitty-gritty of what is being said. But we wanted to keep it as simple and as practical as possible. So with that in mind, I'm going to get started and go to the overview. So this is basically what we're going to focus on today, and I will be taking the first 3 points, and Howard will be wrapping up with the last point. And of course, we did it like that on purpose, because those of you that know Howard and have listened to him in the past, the most entertaining comments are when he has something to say about government policy. So that should lead to interesting discussion. But I'm going to take the bulk of the presentation now, 20 minutes, something like that, and then Howard will wrap up. Now, to start off with, what I basically want to talk about is these few things, but the introduction to it should be, of course, Sri Lanka's crisis that started last year, early last year, and place it in a context that has not often been done, which is that Sri Lanka really was not the only country to experience foreign debt problems. It wasn't even the only country to default on its external debt. Those of you that have been watching the news will have seen that Ghana has gone through something similar. But do you know that the IMF actually estimates that over half of the developing countries are currently at high risk of defaulting on their external debt? So it's important to place it in that context to say that it wasn't just all the unique developments to Sri Lanka that led to that point, but really something else, something more fundamental. And that's in a way what the entire paper is about that we wrote, which is that we see a few countries that have not gotten into trouble, and over the past few decades have avoided trouble altogether. And when we look at those countries, we can see that it's those that have industrialized or are in the process of rapidly industrializing. And that's an important point to make, because it shows what implications it can have for Sri Lanka going forward. Now, in particular, we wanted to start with simple definitions of even the concept of industrialization, because I think now a lot of people are coming to terms with the word and are hearing it everywhere. And of course, the success of Vietnam has done a lot for the concept of export-oriented industrialization, because what Vietnam has done in terms of exports is truly astounding. So that has got quite a few policymakers and people in the media to address it, but we're also seeing quite a bit of confusion. What is industrialization? And there, Howard and I were talking to someone the other day, was asking us, you know, this industrialization is interesting, but does it also include tourism? And that's when we thought, there is really this need for clarification as to what industrialization is, because it has tremendous implications for the policies. And in particular, what is now being discussed in Sri Lanka's policy-making circles is, of course, should we have an activist approach, actively promote production, or should we do a hands-off approach where we say, right, we let the market decide and that will result in the best outcomes? And so that is something that Howard is going to elaborate a bit on after I do my bit. So, to start with, what is industrialization exactly? In its simplest form, it is the development of the manufacturing sector. Basically, it becomes much more important in the economy. So that is not tourism, it is also not agricultural goods being produced like tea and all of that, but what we're really talking about is the manufacturing of clothes, of electronics, televisions, that sort of thing, and a vast array really of goods that we're now seeing. The second aspect of it, which is really important to immediately bring in, is the element of technology. Slightly ironic given our technology failure with the live stream that we were trying to set up. Apologies again for the delay. But it is nonetheless an important aspect of manufacturing, and I'll tell you straight away why. An example is that we've heard over the past few years that Bangladesh is now supposedly an industrializing developing country. And we have to strongly disagree, because even though they have gone down that path of manufacturing garments, I think about 98% of their exports are accounted for by garments, they have not gone down that technological development line where you start getting into more advanced goods, particularly electronics and machinery. And that is where you can see the difference between a country like Bangladesh and Vietnam. Vietnam, which incidentally started off very aggressively with promoting garments, production and exports, but critically diversified into the production and exports of electronics and machinery. And so that's where we are today, where we see this clear distinction between the two. The third aspect of it, and this was in a way forced in by Howard, because I'm, let's say, of a less confrontational nature, but Howard thought that it was actually important to highlight that industrialization cannot be seen as separate from this. And what it is that in the entire history of countries industrializing, we have seen one very important phenomenon, and that is that those countries that have industrialized always try to block those countries that are coming up and trying to industrialize. And it's actually very simple. It's a very simple fact that they don't want competitors to rise up to their companies. And that's why, through every means possible, they try to block the up-and-coming industrializers. And one of the funniest examples is at the very beginning of industrialization, as I think most of you know, the UK was, or Britain was the first to industrialize. And of course, then a few other countries in Europe, Germany and France, were starting to industrialize, but there was another country that was attempting to industrialize, a very new country, and that was the US, which, as you may recall, was still a colony of Britain at the time. But interesting thing we found in a book written by a man called Reinhardt, and his book is called How Rich Countries Got Rich and Poor Countries Stay Poor. The title says enough with the thesis he's putting forward. But I'll give you this one excerpt where, when the US was trying to move down the manufacturing line, The UK was very quick to block it. In fact, do you know that prior to independence, prior to the US independence, Britain had banned any form of manufacturing in the US. They simply banned it. Why manufacturing in particular? Why were they not banning other products? And in fact, the only manufacturing that was allowed was tar and masts, because the British needed those for their ships. But other than that, nothing was allowed, in particular garments and textiles, because as you may recall, that was the primary form of manufacturing that Britain was industrializing on at the time. Even more interesting is that at the time, this is Adam Smith's time, Adam Smith, British economist, went to the US and told them, look, I really don't think it's smart for you to intervene and protect your manufacturing industry. So this is after the US gained independence and was starting to get into it, because, you know, that ban they had to get around. But then Adam Smith comes along and says, I really don't think it's a smart thing to do. You should just stick to what you're producing now, stick to grain production and primary goods, but don't move down the manufacturing line. Alexander Hamilton, first secretary, Treasury Secretary of the US, simply ignored Adam Smith and made sure that their manufacturing companies had the chance to rise up and start competing with the British. The point I'm trying to make here is that something very weird goes on when we talk of international economics. See, as I see quite a few business people here, the way business people view doing business is first and foremost that you are in competition. You know, you have to worry mostly about your competitors, and you're trying to take as big a market share as you can. Yet, when we move to international economics, somehow competition disappears. And we're all friends. You produce what you produce, I'll produce something else. We trade, we get along, and, you know, no confrontation there. And it's a very strange thing, because what we're seeing now is increasingly fierce competition between the industrialized countries. I mean, just look at the war going on semiconductors, and the US and Europe throwing literally billions of dollars at promoting their semiconductor manufacturers. Why? Why are they all fighting about the same thing? Where is the theory of comparative advantage where they each produce something different and they don't support their industries? Remember, free trade, that's how we develop. None of that. And so it's with that in mind that Howard is going to offer a few more comments on what actually happens in the industrializing countries in terms of strategy and policy. But let me just briefly say this, that why industrialization has been so important is what we see is the rapid technology change that goes on in the manufacturing sector when it is promoted correctly, actually starts percolating through the entire economy. And we see product diversification in the manufacturing sector like no other. And it is those two elements combined that really drive economic growth. And we've seen it everywhere. I have an extra chart, even if we have some time to get to it, but I won't show it now, where manufacturing growth clearly drives economic growth. But let me briefly offer some thoughts on why we think that export-oriented industrialization is the only strategy to achieve industrialization. And what I'm talking about here is really only a means to an end. That end is industrialization. The means to get there is export-oriented industrialization. And there are just, I mean, there are more, but three very important aspects to it which allow for developing countries to industrialize rapidly. Because there's a very simple fact. By definition, developing countries are poorer than the advanced countries. Can't be argued against. By definition, their markets are small. And that's why the export orientation is necessary to exploit the wealth in the foreign markets, in the global markets. And so you get even countries like China, which has such a massive population. Why did they adopt an export-oriented strategy? It's simple, because at the time when they wanted to industrialize, there was no middle class to speak of in their own country. So they had to go for export-oriented industrialization. And on the basis of that, grew incredibly fast. The other thing that China did extremely well is attracting foreign manufacturers. But China is not alone there. We've seen it in every successful case. And that is not what is commonly thought, that it's because we need the money from the FDI inflows, the investment inflows from the foreign companies. But it is actually more subtle than that. It is the technology that those companies have. And what has been done incredibly well in the successful countries is that transfer of technology from the foreign companies to the local companies. And this is, of course, where Trump also comes in, and he repeatedly was, of course, bashing China on the behalf of some of the American manufacturers that were accusing the Chinese of having stolen technology. But there were a few very good articles written in response where they actually showed case after case that the American companies had simply written off, had actually agreed to transfer the technology. Because what they got in return was the chance to produce in China. Low labor costs, all the incentives granted by the Chinese government. And that's why they wanted to produce there. And they were more than happy to share eventually some of their technology. But that was a really important point of why it is so important to work with the foreign manufacturers. Two other reasons. One is they also often provide market access. So I'll get to this in the case of Sri Lanka, where it was a really important aspect of the garments, aspect of the success of Sri Lanka's garments industry. And it also, of course, is there for geopolitical reasons. Now, one example I often mention there is how the Vietnamese got in Samsung to produce in Vietnam, and now that offered all the benefits that I mentioned before, but there was one other key thing, and that was that the Korean Development Bank and the Korean Exim Bank immediately opened up credit lines for the Vietnamese, who were in need of it back then, because now they have all the foreign exchange reserves they need. But back when they were first starting to rapidly industrialize, that credit was very valuable to them, much like it would be to Sri Lanka right now. And so that's a very important lesson to take with us. But then the third and final point is those exports, the rapid export growth, offers tremendous foreign exchange earning capabilities. And we can see, I'll get to that chart as well, where all the non-industrializing countries repeatedly get into foreign exchange earning problems and have to borrow and still get into balance of payments problems. And all the industrializers never get into trouble because they have massive foreign exchange reserves that they've built up over the years. Now, if we go back to my definition of industrialization, I just put manufacturing sector is important. One of the measures we have for that is as a percentage of total output, total GDP, how much is accounted for by the manufacturing sector. And you can see the red bars are representing all the industrializers, or a few select East Asian industrializers, and showing them in the periods of rapid industrialization. So by now, Taiwan and Korea and Singapore are all advanced countries, but China and Vietnam are currently still rapidly industrializing. So for the four above, I put in different periods, but for those below the top four, those are all the most recent figures, so that's 2020. And you can see there that that Sri Lanka, among those other countries in blue, are not industrializing to the same extent, according to this indicator. And it's been a very important one, because when we started looking at Vietnam in 2015, Howard told me to start doing some research on Vietnam, just looking up some very simple data. And I told Howard, well, there's one big problem. I'm seeing some really weird stuff when I do this computation for Vietnam. Basically, there was an abbreviation, and I couldn't explain it. So I started looking back and noticed that they had changed the method of computation for the manufacturing sector. And we did our alternative, which actually showed that Vietnam's manufacturing sector was much bigger than official statistics were showing. More interesting still, last year, the Chinese Statistics Office, together with the IMF, revised their data and showed what we had been showing for the last 6 years, which is that the manufacturing sector was actually much larger than they were showing. And so it was important for us, because on that basis and a few other indicators, we could show that Vietnam was actually industrializing. And of course, a few years later, now everyone has caught on, I think, seeing the incredible rise in incomes per capita. Now, remember the second point to my industrialization. It's not just that the manufacturing sector is becoming more important, but we have to see the technology change. And one important aspect of that is the type of manufacturers that are being produced. And there are two very important categories in there. One is garments and textiles. And you can see here, I've taken the first phase of each country's industrialization. Again, it varies a bit. Hong Kong and Japan, of course, 1960s and 70s. South Korea a bit later, and China and Vietnam quite recent. But you can see for all of them, garments and textiles becomes important in the first instance. So what you're seeing here is, as a share of each country's total exports, how much is accounted for by that particular category. And then this is the important second phase, where all of them have shifted into electronics and machinery exports. And it's, for some of them, absolutely astounding. So what we see is that it's typically between 1/2 and 3/4 of their total exports. And it is this that has really convinced us further that Vietnam is now on the right path of industrialization. Remember these two charts, because I'm going to come back to them in a short while. Now, this is probably one of the most important charts that we presented in our study. So I basically took a sample of as many developing countries as had useful data. So I believe the total is 144 countries. And divided them into two simple groups. Are they industrializing or are they not industrializing? Using the concept that I started with. And as you can see, it's incredible that the non-industrializing countries, typically every single period that's highlighted there, have a deficit. And they continuously have to go back to the IMF because they keep running into balance of payments problems. Whereas the industrializing countries never get into trouble. And they have prospered as a result. Now, very short Sri Lanka, because think I may already be approaching my limit. But let me very briefly do it. I wanted to highlight two periods. One is, it's both periods, I would say there was industrialization going on in Sri Lanka. One period was earlier, 1960 to 1977, which is typically referred to as import substituting industrialization. And typically it has been characterized as a failed strategy. I mostly agree, but partly disagree, because I think there are some very important lessons to be learned from that period. And then the period that I would consider successful, depending on what would have happened after if President Premadasa hadn't sadly been taken by the bomb blast in 1994, he never got to continue his strategy of export-oriented industrialization. But I would say he definitely laid the groundwork for it. Now, just one point to make about the first period is, even though in the end there were major failings, primarily because if there is no export orientation, no foreign exchange earnings are coming in. Basically, the strategy is to save as much foreign exchange as you can, block imports, and the philosophy is that Sri Lanka should become independent and produce everything itself. Now, that also means that there were problems with technology, acquiring foreign technology and working with foreign manufacturers coming in, because generally that strategy and the policies in place did not welcome foreign manufacturers to set up shop in Sri Lanka. But there is one very important lesson to take away from this period, is this drive to protect and support Sri Lankan companies. And this is what I bring it back to, understanding the global struggle that is going on between the industrialized and the industrializing countries. Constantly there are the blocks being put in place, and other countries are promoting their companies. Sri Lanka has to do the same. And in that period, there were a lot of concessions and promotions for manufacturers, especially in things like industrial goods, industrial machinery. And this is when we actually saw Brandex being started up, hugely successful now. DSI came up in that period. Jinasena Group was set up in that period. And in that period itself, maybe not that much happened, but they were established and they got that base to later on prosper. And I think it shouldn't be underestimated how much that protection and incentive to move into manufacturing was worth. So that's a very important thing to take with us, because even now that support for Sri Lankan companies is necessary. We can't just have foreign manufacturers setting up shop in Sri Lanka and expecting the country to prosper. It has to be Sri Lankan companies as well. If we then look at the period of export-oriented industrialization, we see that one very important problem of the previous strategy was solved: the foreign exchange earnings. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen graphs of foreign exchange reserves in that time, but it is truly incredible. And President Premadasa was given incredibly bad cards to begin with, because reserves were almost zero and the country was in real trouble. 2 wars being fought at the time. And this man, with the right incentives and the right policies, which Howard will address further, managed to see foreign exchange reserves explode while the country was growing. Because what that means is companies were importing machinery, importing all the raw materials they needed to produce and grow massively. And in spite of that, foreign exchange reserves were still growing because that machine had been turned on. And that was one of the most important things that was solved from the import substituting industrialization time, is the foreign exchange earnings. And you can see, I mean, I don't need to get into the success stories about the garments manufacturers, but one important one to highlight is Lodestar, which some of you, or maybe all of you, have heard of. I hadn't till about a year ago, and I needed to be educated on Lodestar because here I thought it was all about garments in Sri Lanka. But Lodestar, in the 1990s, with the help of concessional finance from the NDB, got to be one of the largest, actually at one point it was the largest producer of solid tires in the world. And not only that, because of Lodestar, other companies in Sri Lanka started to get into the same area of production. And now we have GRI and a couple of others. And Sri Lanka today, from nowhere, from not even producing one single solid tire in the 1980s, now accounts for more than a quarter of the global production of solid tires. It is to show that it is possible. It is possible. And that's why I often, in my presentations, focused on East Asia, but I thought, why? Because I started looking at Sri Lanka's success in the past, and there is a lot to be learned from it. But as I said, President Premadasa's strategy got cut short, and the one thing that he didn't get to do was diversify the production base. And that's where I come back to my first chart on this, where I've put Sri Lanka now in there. So you can see that Sri Lanka went down that same path of textiles and garments. But now here is the problem. All those other countries, the successful industrializers, they went down that path of technological development in the manufacturing sector and got into electronics and machinery. Sri Lanka has not in any significant way. And this is what really needs to happen, because this is where Sri Lanka is. Along with the non-industrializing countries, it is continuously having that deficit and continuously going back to the IMF. Not because it fails to do every little single thing that the IMF tells it to do, but because it has never solved this problem. It has never gone down, or except for that period of Premadasa, gone down the path of industrialization. But once that happens, the IMF will have to leave Sri Lanka alone, because it won't be necessary anymore. But Howard is now going to elaborate a bit more about the types of policies that we think are necessary to achieve this. Thank you.
I'll just take about an hour. I'm not going to elaborate. I'm going to do something very different. I'm going to start by asking you, have you ever heard of this expression, cognitive dissonance? Okay, so you have a belief system and you have reality. And the reality contradicts your belief system. And cognitive dissonance is when you still hold on to your belief system, no matter what that reality is. And that's a psychological trauma, basically, a problem that you have. I see this cognitive dissonance all the time with policymakers and academics in Sri Lanka. And it has to do with the IMF, basically. So, what I wanted to say is that, let me repeat what Bram said. Advanced countries always blocked developing countries. They blocked them in many different ways. He didn't mention it because he's a gentleman. But the British faced one country which was far more advanced than they were in garments and textiles. India, especially Bihar. Everybody knows that. The British royal family only bought Indian textiles because British was rubbish compared to India. India was far ahead. And even after the British imposed tariffs, when essentially the British public kept buying Indian garments and textiles, they physically smashed machines and destroyed physically Indian garments and textile industry. At the very same time, David Ricardo is preaching doctrine of comparative advantage and free trade. You understand? So, of course, they don't believe in it. The advanced countries have never believed in it. This is hypocrisy of the highest order. This is only to get you to do what they want you to do. This has nothing to benefit the developing country. Do I blame them? No, I don't blame them. This is the economic war we speak of. I blame our intellectuals. Where are they? Can I even call them intellectuals? No, I can't. You know, what are our policymakers doing? So, I come to Sri Lanka. People have been complaining about me. Can you believe that? People criticizing me. I can't, you know, I'm a very popular guy and, you know, people like me a lot and so on. But they say, why are you always going on about the IMF? You know, why do you see the IMF as the villain? Why? Because I have studied the IMF for 40 years. I have taught for 40 years about the IMF. I know every detail about the IMF that there is to know about the IMF. I know trivia about the IMF that most people don't know. I even wanted to write a book about the IMF, but I preferred to write a book about price theory instead. So when people come and say, you're always criticizing the IMF, you know, why are you criticizing the IMF? Sometimes I have to resist saying, are you stupid or what? IMF was set up explicitly to protect the interests of the advanced countries. It had one mandate to keep developing countries coming back to it so that it could keep tweaking the policies of the developing country. Have you ever read any proper histories? No, I'm sorry, people don't. They think the IMF is there to help us. Does this mean to say I recommend people not working with the IMF? No, you can't do that. We're in trouble. We have to work with them. But are you going to keep your eyes closed? This is the point, because they're going to recommend things to us that are going to be detrimental to our ability to industrialize. This is their job. This is their job. I read an article recently, listen to the title of this article, it's brilliant. It is the policy that shall not be named. You know, Harry Potter, Voldemort, the person that we shall not have the name of. So it's the policy that shall not be named. These are two IMF people admitting that the IMF doesn't want to hear the word industrialization within the walls of the building of IMF. Because its mandate is to block industrialization. Of course it is. It was set up to do exactly that. Same with the World Bank. Same with the WTO. Do we not work with them? We work with them. But once you understand the game they're playing, you can be much more efficient. You can use the spaces to basically industrialize. When people tell me, look, if we just implement the IMF's policies, we'll be okay. You mean the 17th time we'll be okay, but the other 16th time we weren't okay? Ghana 18 times, they weren't okay, but now the 19th time they're going to be okay. Why do you think everybody keeps going back to the IMF? Because they're recommending policies to you that takes you back to them. That is the game they have played. Of course it is. We're naive to think otherwise. But that is where the cognitive dissonance comes in. You know, the Americans have great PR. We are here to help you. IMF, you know, we've got sophisticated models. We've got all these people who are very learned and professors of this and that. They're all from Harvard or Yale or Boston somewhere or another. It's a PR job. I've got to convince you that what I'm giving you is science instead of bullshit. Okay? And that is the game. Again, I don't blame them. I'm asking, really? Our academics are so dumb and naive they haven't read a damn thing about the IMF? Come on. You know, what have they studied? I know what they've studied. They've studied models. You know, but they have never studied the institutional historical environment. They've never understood this context in which we, Sri Lanka, we are operating. I'm just going to give you 3 examples why it makes a difference. First, we hear it all the time, the mantra now. We can achieve liberalization, we can achieve industrialization, export-oriented industrialization, by liberalizing trade. I've heard it several times. There are very prominent politicians who are repeating this thing. I mean, I'm not talking about the president of the country, but I'm talking about opposition politicians as well, who are saying all we have to do is liberalize. Okay? Really? Is there any historical example of a country industrializing by simply liberalizing? Of course not. Of course not. This is the dead rope we're being sold. Now, if we believe that, we deserve what we get. Because it's not going to happen. It has never happened before. Does this mean to say I'm against trade liberalization? No, I'm not. I'm very much in favor of export orientation. We have to access the world market. We need imports, but we also need to use our brains. We do not just throw our companies into the whirlpool of the world market. We give them as much support as we possibly can, because it's a very violent, competitive world out there. Similarly, there are imports that we need to block. We can't do it officially through tariffs anymore, but there are lots of other ways we can do these things. Where there is a will, there's always a way. Our problem is there's no will. Second one, FDI. Bram already touched on it, but let me repeat it. The idea that we get from policymakers, academics, etc., is all we need to do is attract foreign capital. All we need to do is get our Samsung, like Vietnam got Samsung. So we need another thing like Samsung. But what they're missing is, how did Vietnam really succeed? Only by FDI? No. They used FDI to promote their own businesses, to grow their own businesses. That is why Vietnam has already produced its own smartphone, is now producing and exporting to the United States an EV. You know? And it's going great guns down that road. What it has done is it's used continuously foreign investors to leverage their own production base. This is the crucial difference. Study recently asked, why has Malaysia started to go backwards compared to Korea and also Vietnam? The study finds out that unlike Korea and Vietnam and Singapore, Malaysia only relied on the foreign multinationals. They did not actually promote their own companies and industrial base. That was the big difference. And this is why Malaysia started to go backwards, having done so well up to this point. So it's an important lesson. This ideological mindset that people get, oh, just leave it up to the foreigners. They'll somehow, because they love Sri Lanka after all, everyone loves Sri Lanka, don't they? So they'll come here and make us rich and prosperous and so on without our own producers doing anything. Maybe we'll ship our own producers off to Bangladesh or somewhere else. Okay? You see how stupid it is. This is the problem of cognitive dissonance. We know these facts that I talk of. But our brain, the way we have been conditioned also academically, we can't understand the reality. We can't make sense of that reality. I'm going to end with my third one. Don't all of you say, oh God, not again. You know what I'm going to talk about? Development finance. NDB. Privatization of NDB. All the successful countries, all the advanced countries provide huge amounts of concessional long-term finance to their industry. I'll give you, so normally I talk about Japan and the 3 development banks of Japan, or Korea, the 3 development banks of Korea, or Singapore, who help us set up the NDB. But I'm actually going to talk about Germany. KfW. Have you ever heard of KfW? Read up. KfW. It's a bank for reconstruction in Germany that was set up in 1947. And it has bankrolled virtually the whole of German industry. Concessional long-term finance. Incidentally, while they're coming and preaching to Sri Lanka that it's wrong to have development banks in Sri Lanka, this one entity has provided so much concessional finance. It came to a point, 2007 to 2009, when Germany decided to go to alternate energy. Alternate energy, very expensive, phenomenally given their plan. This one entity provided 100% of all financing of every single project started in that period in Germany. 100% financing. And they come and preach to us and tell us, oh, mustn't have development banking, very bad. Develop your financial markets. They'll provide the long-term concessional financing. Cognitive dissonance again. We say, oh, yes, yes, yeah, you're right, you're right. Show me the example. Show me the example anywhere. But what happens is we try and convince ourselves that what they're telling us is not bullshit. You know, there is some sense, and we will sort of scurry around trying to find one minuscule example. You see, I found one long-term private financial institution that has lent something or another. All is rubbish. It is utter rubbish. Even the US government has a small business administration program. We say small business administration. It is a vast program that is bankrolling businesses across the United States. They come to Sri Lanka or privatize your NDB. Don't do development banking. It's a game. It's a game. It's a war. Am I blaming the Americans? Am I blaming the Germans? Do I blame the Japanese? No, I blame ourselves. And I blame our policymakers, I blame our academics, I blame our politicians. We don't have the ability to understand simple facts and question. Give me an example to prove that there's ever been long-term concessional financing provided by private banks. Okay? You can't find that. People come with all manner of excuses, but sorry, I end with problem of cognitive dissonance. Have to now solve that. Perhaps treating politicians would be a starting point for this cognitive dissonance, but I think a lot of them are beyond redemption, isn't it? Okay, thank you.
Yes, yes.
You want to start?
Okay, thank you very much for the interesting presentations. Let me invite the invited panelists one by one. I will have the... Can you get me the list of names, please? We will start with Vagisha Gunasekara. We will have, I think 7 o'clock is the closing time.
10 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes.
Sorry.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Bram, Howard, and the Gamini Korea Foundation for inviting me to share some thoughts about the paper written by Bram and Howard. I'd like to structure my comments in 3 parts. One is a quick reflection of the paper and its significance as I was reading it. 2, I also would like to table a question about the timing of seriously pursuing an export-oriented industrial program in the context of a global recession and long business cycles. This is something that, Howard, you have written about, you talk about. And the third part is my own little contribution, very minor contribution, which is to marry the industrial policy and sustainability with an outline of opportunity areas in the green and blue economies. This perhaps complements the point about technological change and moving up the value chain, and addresses a key challenge which you talk about in the paper, an energy strategy complementary to the industrial strategy and policy. First, my quick reflection. Congratulations on an excellent paper. And I think it makes a very convincing case for export-oriented industrial development in Sri Lanka. The paper picks up significance, especially in the current context of finding solutions to respond to Sri Lanka's balance of payment crisis. And it quite correctly puts the finger on the weak external balance and presents sustainable solution for focusing on trade. And it also goes beyond mainstream views to provide the core elements of an export-oriented industrialization strategy. One minor addition, if I may, add to the list of challenges in executing a robust export-oriented industrial strategy is public sector modernization and digitalization of processes to increase the efficiency in systems. Because right now, if any of you in the audience, if you are an industrialist or an exporter, you will find that the number of approvals, the licensing arrangements, and the number of things you have to do, the bureaucratic red tape is immense. There are at least 17 different approvals you have to get if you are to start any type of industry in Sri Lanka. And the approval processes can take up to 2.5 years for some people. So that's my first point. And the second point, again a minor addition, is perhaps some thought into the type of tax regime required to boost export-oriented industrialization. I say this particularly in light of the current or the recent policy changes to rationalize VAT exemptions and the removal of simplified value-added tax. And this has come under heavy criticism by exporters in Sri Lanka. So perhaps talking about a suitable tax regime might be a good minor addition. Now I'm going to table my question, which is the second part. We all know that the global economy is now in its steepest slowdown following a post-recession recovery since 1970. And the global consumer confidence has already suffered a much sharper decline than in the run-up to previous global recessions. And the three largest economies, the United States, China, and the Euro area, have been slowing very sharply. So under these circumstances, even a moderate hit to the global economy over the next year could tip into recession. And central banks around the world have been raising interest rates this year, say it started last year, this year as well, with I think a degree of synchronicity not seen over the past 5 decades. This is a trend that is likely to continue well into next year. So what are the implications of this particular context for crafting an industrial policy for a country like Sri Lanka? That's the question. And now the last part of my intervention, which is my little contribution, which is simply to draw attention to the increasing global agenda to marry industrial development and sustainability. You talked about how the early industrializing countries always block or stifle the growth of industrialization in latecomers, right? So one caveat I have to make is that the green agenda is often pushed deliberately to stifle or block industrialization in developing countries. This is used for sure. And of course, there's an irony in this because the global north, which is responsible for about 92% of the greenhouse gas emissions, they in turn turn around and put restrictions on developing countries like ours, saying that you cannot industrialize, and we must reduce our pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. However, that being said, I think there are opportunities that are also presented in the green industrialization agenda. And a recent report by UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, it argues that the transformation into a green economy will open what they call green windows of opportunity, which should allow developing countries to both catch up and forge ahead in green sectors and create value chains. I would like to show a couple of slides just to show the potential areas. Now, green economy, of course, the concept of the green economy started during Rio +20 conference in 2012, and parallelly, small island developing countries, they started making a case for a blue economy, leveraging the frontier that has not been explored, which is the oceans and the seas, right? And of course, in a world transforming towards a greener global economy, I think it's necessary to focus particularly on the type of development that is required. This is what I call techno-economic development, because technology is a big part of this. And this is aimed at innovations related to green and blue economies. And there are many traditional and emerging sectors that are high growth areas in this industrial space. Renewable energy is certainly one of them. I'm not going to describe the slides to you, it'll take too much time. So this is just to give you a snapshot of what the possibilities are in the green and blue economies. Of course, there is a certain level of idealism tied to green industrial agenda, that innovation in these areas will contribute to economic diversification and creation of higher wage jobs while also protecting the planet. It's not as rosy as it sounds, but it certainly presents certain opportunities with the principles that Bram, you and Howard presented, which is on protection of nascent industries in either green or blue areas. So there are, and this is just to show you the potential for renewables. Renewables is a big field, a subsector in the area of green industry. The potential is to, renewables to produce 85% of global power, so 50% of energy by 2050. That's the projection right now. And these are some potential blue sectors. And what of course, tourism is there, and I know tourism is not a manufacturing industry, but in each of these different sectors, there are value chains that are currently in the process of getting sophisticated. And Sri Lanka's has not even, Sri Lanka has a ocean area that is already 8 times bigger than our landmass. And if we do get claims to the extra ocean area that we have submitted a claim for, our marine space will be 23 times bigger than our landmass. So there is huge potential in these areas to explore in future. And this is just to give you a snapshot of the renewables investment opportunities identified for Sri Lanka. There's great scope for grid-connected solar, wind, sustainable fuel wood, biomass, and various biomass energy technologies. But first of all, I think the problem lies in us not identifying where in the value chain can we start with and can we move up. And this is where we can learn a lot from countries like China, who've really, they have mature industries when it comes to renewables. And even in the blue economy sector, we currently, we do have mature industries such as ports, fisheries, but I don't think we can call them mature in the sense that it's discussed in the global arena, because technologically we are very behind, rather behind in these sectors. And I know I'm out of time right now, so I'll just stop here. I just wanted to give you a quick burst on the potential that comes with the green and the blue development agendas and the types of sectors and subsectors that Sri Lanka can exploit. But all of this requires careful planning. And this is what I would like to end with. Green, blue, or traditional brown industrial development, this requires long-term economic planning by a state. And we all know that Sri Lanka had, we have a history of having 5-year plans and 10-year plans in the 1960s and the 70s, but we do not anymore. After the 1977 open economy reforms, our planning became it got put in the back seat. We used to have a Ministry of Planning, and I don't think we currently do. It's tucked safely under the Ministry of Finance, and it's a department right now. But yeah, I would like to end by saying that, of course, there are lots of innovative growth areas that where we can marry both industrial development and green and blue agendas, the sustainability agenda, but identifying our place in these markets and the type of technology catch-up we need to make, the type of policy catch-up we need to make, this all requires careful long-term planning, which is, I think, the need of the hour right now. Thank you very much.
Let's listen to all the panelists and then go on to question time and opportunities for the audience members. Let's listen to Sunila Beva then. Second panelist.
Yeah, good evening. I was really hoping to touch on three aspects of development: infrastructure, missed opportunities, and financing development. But I'm dropping the financing part of it because of time constraints. But before I start, I would like to thank Howard and Bram and the Gamini Korea Foundation, and also pay a small tribute to the late Dr. Gamini Korea, a great friend of my parents and of the family. 70 years ago, in his doctoral thesis, the late Gamini Korea had mentioned that the plantation economy was so unstable that we needed to build in a stabilizer in the form of industrial development. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. If it had happened, we probably would have been in a different situation. The reason I decided to touch on infrastructure is because you would notice that the present foreign debt, 2/3 of the foreign debt has been taken for project loans. And if you take into account the other loans that were taken to pay off those loans, then it's almost 100%. The idea of development is to keep development costs low. The high-performing Asian economies realized this very early and developed their heavy construction sector. In fact, until very recently, it was a no-go area for foreign contractors. I'm speaking more from personal experience because I used to be the CEO of Sri Lanka's largest heavy construction company, which is no more. It was known as CDE. Some of you may have probably heard of it, Ceylon Development Engineering Company. And Sri Lanka too developed the heavy construction industry to world-class level and reversed the process to the present level of having one of the highest development costs. Let me give a short history of the infrastructure development. The first major project after independence in 1949 was the Galloya project. And since we didn't have the engineering depth at that time, an American company, Morrison Knudsen International, was awarded the tender and the project was completed. Cost being plus or minus $100 million. In today's money, it's over $1 billion. Because of the high cost, after Galloya, a few local companies engaged in irrigation development work and had done quite well. In fact, the company that I was CEO had done projects like Rajangana, Pimurathava, Chandrika Veva, and so on and so forth. But the government then was keen to get the Udavalave project off the ground. But there was a problem. The government had nationalized the foreign oil companies a couple of years before. The Americans cut off aid, and therefore the World Bank refused to fund Sri Lanka. Now the government was in a fix. They had to get the Udavalave project going, that there was no funding for it. the government then picked the only company that was capable of doing the project, CDE, and asked CDE to seek technical expertise from the socialist bloc. Czechoslovakia readily agreed not only to give technical expertise, but machinery as well. They said, you do the work, we'll supervise, but only thing is when you're paying, please pay us in hard currency. The project was completed. The cost was less than $10 million. Remember, Galloya was 100 million 15 years earlier, and this was less than $10 million. The same procedure was followed for the Maskelia project, the hydropower project of Maskelia with the Yugoslavs. There again, technical expertise was obtained, machinery was given, and mind you, Maskelia was a much more complicated project because the Mausakalai Dam at that time was the largest concrete dam in the country before Victoria was built. The tunnels and the powerhouse. What happened with all this is there was a tremendous transfer of technology, which otherwise we would not have got. And with that transfer of technology, the local company, CDE, qualified to becoming an international contractor with the ability to do work funded by the World Bank and the ADB even overseas. And we did do work in Nigeria and Indonesia. And what CDE was able to prove, the point that it proved was that the impossible was possible. Not many understood this point, including the new government that came into power in 1977. In fact, CDE was described as a national asset, later destroyed by government policy. The reason I'm telling you all this is because these mistakes are being repeated over and over again. However much we develop our export-oriented industries, that money may never be sufficient to pay off these loans that are being taken for infrastructure projects at high costs. So then after that, after the 1977 change of government, the government started the accelerated Mahawali program. The main projects were shut for locals due to funding agreements. So there was no technological transfer, high costs. 30% of the entire cost had to be borne by government, which in my opinion, we could have completed the entire accelerated Mahawali program with that 30%. And don't forget that the overruns were on loans at 7.5% interest, which is almost similar to the ISB rates of interest. And also, one has to understand that building a company like that to world-class standard needs a tremendous amount of dedication and effort. Now that the government couldn't understand. I don't know why. But the turning point came in 1981 when the Mahawali called for international competitive bids for the System C project. CDE, being a local company, was the lowest bidder, and the technical evaluation committee recommended to cabinet that it be awarded to this company. When it went to cabinet, the president, taking his own minister by surprise, who had submitted the cabinet paper, said, no, we can't give this to a local company. We have to give this to a Japanese company. I don't know why he was bending backwards trying to please the Japanese. Probably he was expecting more aid. But finally, well, he was an all-powerful president. The president had his way, and it was awarded to a Japanese company at almost double the price. And that was the death blow to the local construction industry. From then on, all major projects have been highly overpriced and given to foreign contractors. But let me also tell you how President Park in Korea reacted to a similar situation. The Koreans wanted to build a dam across the Soyang River, and the leftover of the former regime, officials like what we have, were very keen to give this to a Japanese company. They had got a design, a very expensive design, done by the Japanese, and 140-meter high concrete dam. And in the presentation to the president, it said, you know, this is an excellent design. This should be given to the Japanese. But at the back of President Park's head, the idea of money flowing out of Korea, he was not happy with that. What he did was he called up the leading Korean construction company at that time, Hyundai, and asked them to give a design. They gave a design which was a 100-meter high earth dam at a considerable saving. And of course, the officials laughed at it and said, no, this can't be done, you know, it's impossible, and so on and so forth. Then at the next presentation, the president asked his technocrats, has anybody considered the security aspect? Because this was a time of high tension between North and South. He asked his officials, what if the North Koreans come and bomb the dam? Oh, they said it will be disaster. Then he also asked them, what would happen if they bomb the 100-meter high earth dam? They all thought for a while and said, if they bomb the earth dam, the dam will collapse on itself and the damage will be minimal. There you go. So that's how the president of Korea fought for his companies. Now we have the complete opposite. I still really can't understand why President Jayawardena sort of wanted to please the Japanese to that extent, because, I mean, he was not a fool. I mean, he should have known that aid also has its limits. Anyway, then next is we come to the highways. Do you know that the highways in this country are the most expensive highways in the world? It doesn't cost so much to build highways in the United States, but these highways are the most expensive highways in the world. In fact, Professor Amal Kumarage from the University of Moratuwa has published a paper on that. It's very interesting. Those of you who can get your hand on it, please read it. And it's obvious that this money is going somewhere else. I mean, there's no two words about it. So this leak of money has to be plugged. It's now a deluge. So unless you plug this leak, nothing much is going to change. If all the money taken for projects had been used, we would have properly used, we would have been able to complete the entire infrastructure needed for Sri Lanka for the next 25 years, and had even quite a hefty reserve. Let me also tell you another small story. Jiang Zemin, former president of China from 1989 until 2003, he visited Sri Lanka in the early 1980s to have a look at the free trade zone. He was not president at that time, he was an official. He visited the free trade zone. By the way, this was in an article by Sugat Kulatunga. He had visited the free trade zone and then finally had said, you have a literate society, strategic location, rich ocean around you, reasonable administration, and many advantages other countries do not have. And then virtually shouted at him and said, what then is your problem? In my opinion, he did not factor in corruption and ignorance, which has become the invisible hand that guides our economy. Anyway, I think I got to stop now. Okay, sorry. Thank you.
Sorry, Sunil, I had to draw your attention to the time several times. Let me then invite the last panelist, Mr. Dhammika Fernandes.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So, thanks, Howard, for inviting me for this erudite panel. And, well, he wanted me to introduce myself to the audience. Okay, said that I'm Dhammika Fernando, all right. And I happen to be the current chairman of the Free Trade Zones Manufacturers Association of Sri Lanka, and also a board member of the Joint Apparel Association Forum. I hope that would do, and I'm an industrialist in the EPZ Katunayaka. So I think in the interest of time, I just have prepared some notes on the presentation, and congratulations on your presentation, Bram, and Howard, the paper. I have segmented into three areas. First is about the difficulties faced and the several key issues in export-oriented industrial development in Sri Lanka, which are some of the major challenges. And secondly, about the predicament of apparel. And thirdly, about the future of export orientation. So I'll try to finish it within my 10 minutes as much as possible. Well, overarching fact about the export orientation, I would say in Sri Lanka, is about value addition, which is the most important, because we are probably a cheap investment destination so far. So some of the key or major challenges that we face is, firstly, the infrastructure, where the inadequacy of infrastructure, including transportation, energy, and logistics, which can hinder the efficiency of the competitiveness of export-oriented industries in Sri Lanka, and insufficient port facilities. I would say, okay, now it's been developed, but the other things like, you know, calling of vessels to the country and air freights, and these are some other things which are very important and sine qua non for export orientation. And unreliable power supply, energy issue, and inadequacy of transportation networks can increase cost and limit the ability to exporting of goods. Second, I identify it as trade barriers and market access. which is one of the other important things which hampers our export orientation, which industries heavily rely on accessing international markets. The trade barriers such as tariff and non-tariff barriers, plus the complex trade regulations which can restrict market access and make it difficult for Sri Lankan products to compete globally. Further expanding and diversifying exports market requires addressing these barriers and improving our market access regime. When the skill and labor force, developing export-oriented industries often requires skilled workforce. We all, maybe the general feeling or the kind of idea is that we have a very literate skilled workforce. But on the contrary, if we deep dive into this matter, we find it we don't have the required skills in our country. The particular skills which requires for the development of the particular industries that we need to proliferate or we need to develop. And this needs a lot of attention, which requires, in terms of education and skill development, with the gaps between industry requirements and the skills of the labor force, which we should enhance vocational training programs and investing in education and skill development, which are crucial to meet the demands of export-oriented industries. The fourth one, which I recognize, is that innovation and technology adaptation. Embracing innovation, which and adaptation of advanced technologies is crucial. That we see, I would tell you when I talk about the predicament of apparel, why it is important. And the Sri Lanka needs to focus on research and development more, promote technology transfer, and encourage collaboration between academia and the industry to foster innovation and technology adaptation. Fifth is the regulatory environment. Ladies spoke about this, and complex and burdensome regulatory environment which can impede the growth of export-oriented industries, and we are experiencing it as industrialists, and streamlining regulations, reducing bureaucratic red tapes, and improving the ease of doing business, which are essential to attract investment and foster a favorable environment for export-oriented industries. You see this ease of doing business index when we talk about it. 10 years back, we were kind of higher up in the index, but now we are going down there on the ease of doing business index. Also, access to finance. Again, Howard talked about this development banking. One is the NDB and other was the DFCC, right? Yeah. So the access to finance is very difficult in our country, which is particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs and micros. Also can hinder their ability to invest in export-oriented activities, enhancing access to finance and providing tailored financing products, and support SMEs with credit facilities and export promotion schemes can help overcome this challenge. Seventh is about the sustainability and environmental concerns. As the world focuses on sustainability and development, export-oriented industries need to address environment and social concerns, ensuring sustainable production practices, complying with international standards, and promoting eco-friendly manufacturing process, and crucial for long-term viability and the market acceptance. No matter whatever said and done, we talk about America, we talk about Europe, but they are the biggest buyers from us still. 80% of our industrial products goes there. And addressing these key issues require coordinated efforts from the government and private sector and other stakeholders. It involves implementing supportive policies investing in infrastructure and development, fostering and skilled workforce, promoting innovation, and enhancing the overall business environment to facilitate export-oriented industries development. The country's future export strategy would require comprehensive approach which requires policy reforms and infrastructure development, skill enhancement, and also the manufacturing diversification, as Howard talked about and also Bram talked about. So now I'll come to the predicament of apparel. So while the apparel industry has been a significant contributor to Sri Lankan export-oriented industrial development in the past, it is true that diversification and exploring new sectors are important for sustainable economic growth. In my word, apparel is not the future of Sri Lankan export orientation. Although, in apparel, all right. But you see, there are several reasons why some may argue that the future of Sri Lanka export orientation may not solely rely on the apparel industry. Firstly, the global market dynamism, where the global textile and apparel industry is highly competitive right now, and emerging economies with lower labor costs have become strong players in this sector. Sri Lanka faces challenges in terms of rising labor costs and increasing competition, which may impact the long-term sustainability of the apparel industry. Probably some of you may not know Sri Lanka is no more a labor-cheap country. And thankful to some of the local investors, the local apparel is driven by the local industry right now. I mean, that is something that we can, be happy about at least. The technological advancement, automation and digitalization are rapidly transforming industry worldwide, including textile and apparel. The adaptation of advanced technologies, such as robotics and artificial intelligence, which may reduce the dependency on labor-intensive manufacturing and shift the focus towards higher value-added industries. So the Sri Lankan apparel also, if we do not go that path, we have many other ways. If we are going forward with apparel and making more profits and making more foreign income from apparel, that is one way of doing that. And the other way is diversification, in the sense backward integration and lateral integration of the apparel right now, which is not happening, though the government is trying some things to do that. Then the economic diversification. To ensure sustainable economic growth, Sri Lanka needs to diversify its export base and explore new sectors with higher value addition potential. As I said at the beginning, value addition is the most important thing which overarches everything with regard to export orientation, because right now the apparel industry does not add value more than 30%. Maximum maybe 30%. Mostly even less. And then changing consumer preferences, consumer demands are evolving with the increasing focus on sustainability, ethical sourcing, and product differentiation. And Sri Lanka has the potential to capitalize on its reputation for quality and sustainability by exploring niche markets and offering value-added products in sectors beyond apparel. So regional integration and trade agreements, which is very much important, but we have to go with trade agreements very carefully, because that is a very tricky area. But regional integration, yes, it is very much important, where that such as the South Asian Free Trade Agreement and potential future agreements like Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Can
you finish in about a minute's time?
Yeah, sure, I'll do that. Okay. Have I gone over? Okay, sorry. So the future export orientation, I'd say that information technology, IT, business process management, these are some of the areas that future orientation when we talk about. And says agriculture, but agro-processing and food export is an industry. Of course, rubber-based industry is something which related to agriculture, and apparel and textile, high value addition, as I said. And then renewable energy and sustainable technologies. Especially there are some sectors which are being neglected, such as gem and jewelry, which is very important, which we can bring in a lot of foreign currency to the country with gem and jewelry, which we are not exploiting it which very much. And also the electronics and IT-based industries, such as you said, chip manufacturing, all right. But then we have this graphene industry and things like that. So thank you very much. In the interest of time, I finished my...
Would you like to take a few minutes to address some of those issues? 5 minutes? 10 minutes?
5 minutes, let me hold you.
Yeah. After you address some of these issues?
Just going to bring back in the context I started with some of the comments made. Keep it brief. One question I always had, Vagisha, is nuclear energy green? Because I believe there are now serious plans of setting up a nuclear power plant, but it always seems ambiguous in international circles whether that is green or not. Fusion is green. Okay, all right. I'm very much in favor of nuclear energy, but I think it's an important step. If you look at who is setting up the most nuclear power plants in the world now, it's China. And they are doing that with one thing in mind, and that is lowering production costs. One other thing Vagisha mentioned is this, in a way, problem that the developing countries face when this green energy is forced on them, because it can become problematic in terms of, as Howard said, Germany only managed to finance it by pouring billions of state financing into it. How are the developing countries supposed to do it? But China did do something very interesting and said, okay, if you are so interested in this green energy thing, we'll produce all the solar panels you need for that. And as we know, they produce something like 80% of the global production of solar panels, and have actually managed to lower the cost of those things by 95% over the past 25 years. Without China, nobody would be using solar panels at this moment in time. So I think that's an important thing you highlighted there, that Sri Lanka should think of how it gets into those supply chains. There is so much manufacturing involved with even parts of nuclear power plants, wind energy, the turbines, and quite technologically sophisticated. Sunil, also thank you for your contributions. I highlighted the fact that you mentioned something I forgot, which is what was successful about that period of import substituting industrialization is also the savings that the government tried to make in foreign exchange earnings. Of course, there needs to be the actual earning of foreign exchange, but there's nothing wrong with trying to save it by getting local companies to pick up most of the production and even infrastructure projects. So I thought that was a very important point you highlighted. And then I think that nationalism of President Park that you mentioned, not chauvinism, but nationalism in the sense that he fought tooth and nail to promote his own companies, I think is such an important lesson. Again, going back to the earlier policies, but something that has been lost in this ideological change of we have to liberalize everything and get all the foreign manufacturers here and forget about the domestic producers. So I like that point you made. Then, Damika, thank you for your contribution as well. What I got from it were quite a few points, but just the one that was notable to me was this thing that we may have a highly educated workforce, but the proper skills are perhaps not there. And this is also, if we look at what the Vietnamese government forced Samsung to do, because they gave a lot to Samsung, in terms of incentives. They gave tax concessions, they gave reduced import duties. They even gave the Samsung executives a special gate at the airport in Hanoi, so they wouldn't have to wait in line to see all the ministers in Hanoi. But one important thing they asked from Samsung is also to train their workforce. And not just the workforce within the company, because they had to employ Vietnamese, obviously, but also giving scholarships for relevant fields, not just anything, but in engineering and things like that. So that is one thing I noted. Yeah, I'm going to leave it at that, and then give the floor to anyone in the audience that wants to ask questions.
No, let me give some opportunity to the audience. At least 10-15 minutes for you.
Thank you. I'm Vinod Munasinghe. I was chairman of the Ceylon German Technical Training Institute until last year. I'd just like to make 4 points. The first one was regarding the so-called import substitution era of 1956 to 1977. In the first place, I don't think there was ever any intention to produce everything in Sri Lanka. That simply was not possible, and it was not considered to be. And in fact, in 1968, when Philip Gunawardena was the Minister of Industries, the official policy switched over to export-driven industrialization. It is not something that is widely known. And in fact, it's at that time that you got companies like Munchie exporting overseas for the first time. And then during the 1970s, you got for example, Noritake being invited here to, and in fact, the fundamental reason for establishing the Ceramics Corporation was to export. And during the 5-year plan looked into this question as well. They were planning to, for example, to add value to ilmenite sands. This is in 1972, but it didn't succeed because of the 1973 crisis. And in addition, they started promoting garments, which is not something that is widely known. The garment industry, the modern garment industry in Sri Lanka started in 1973. The Jill company started this factory in Atmalana. That was one point I'd like to make, that it was, and in fact it was very successful, that policy, because in that period we managed to achieve a level of 22% of the GDP being in manufacturing. That was my first point. The second point I'd like to make is that, as Mr. Fernando said, there's a lot. We have to look at this.
If you are brief, it might help us.
Yeah, just 3 points. What Mr. Fernando said is that we have to be very holistic in our approach to industrialization. We can't just think in terms of we are going to manufacture, say, garments. How are we going to help them to do it? How are we going to give them the spare parts they need, the machines they need? And that is something that was never gone into. As you said, we need to go back up the supply chain. That is not happening in Sri Lanka. The next one I want to talk about is training, because it was a subject that I was involved in. And in fact, I find that the government, the structure of the government, the the government servants don't really understand anything about industrial training. They don't know what is required, and the amount of money that has to be invested into training somebody. Now, we managed to open up a new institute in Anamadua to train agricultural machinery repair and repair personnel. Because we have been bringing the people over from India to do it. Can you imagine an agricultural country which is bringing people from overseas to repair agricultural machinery? So this is one subject that is very important and which very few people really understand about. And one thing that you need is to have the workers have to go and get their training in industry. You can't just train them in a school and send them into industry. They have to, from day one, they have to be oriented towards industry. And the final thing I want to talk about is, just if you'll bear with me, is about research and development. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a high level of investment in research and development. There are quite a few innovations that came out during that time. The most important of them being the fluidized bed dryer, the tea dryer, which very few people know about. That was a Sri Lankan invention, and the tea machinery industry was at the cutting edge of technology at that period. So, but after that, the amount of interest in research and development fell considerably. And today it's almost non-existent. And it's very difficult to get the government to say. Now, at the German Tech, we started a research and development section. But where's the funding for it? How we to do the research and development? That is something we need to, the Koreans invest over 3% of their GDP in research and development. Sri Lanka invests 0.1% of its GDP. You can't do that, right? Thank you.
Opposition leader's father. It took about how many years? Was it 3 years? He brought back the economy, 5 years. So now, Dr. Nicholas, Mr. Nicholas, I would like to know how many years will Sri Lanka come back? Because the crisis is very, the economic crisis is very, very bad. So why don't you all come forward and help the president of Sri Lanka be in the advisory board and see that how to speed up. At the moment we are very, very bad, I don't know how. Then the second question is from the BOI, Mr. I don't know, I forgot your name. You were talking about the gem and jewelry industry. I was the first one. I was in gem and jewelry for 50 years. I was the first one who took the second largest stone in the world. That was the treasure. I opened the gateway for the Japanese to come to Sri Lanka. It was unfortunate. Today I would have brought in about 5 or 10 billion into the country. It was unfortunate. I got caught to a very bad situation by the mafias, where the ambassador of Sri Lanka was involved, and the foreign ministry did not help me from the secretaries on. I am very, very sorry to say that today the reason why the country is going into problem is because they did not help me. The foreign ministry secretaries are here, but they all covered. They want to support the crooked, that is the crook. I am very sorry to say it was Charlie Mahendran who did the damage. I was mentally completely out. The whole world came to know. He is the father of the person who was involved in the central bank treasury bond. I am very sorry to say that.
Thank you very much. Let me...
because I am very so hurt. Even the foreign ministry secretary from Bernard Thiruratna, and now even Ravinath is also there. I am very sorry.
No, you are going into personal details. I'll stop.
I am very sorry about it. I had to bring it because it's burning. My heart is burning.
Why don't you take the next question? Speak first. Can you bring the mic here? The front row, please. You want to speak, right?
My name is Lalit Katapidia. My question is, now I fully agree with what Bram and Howard presented, the ideas. There's no argument. These are the things that we need to do. But my question now is, in the absence of the people or the leadership that could do it, we need to find some other strategy. You know, for more than 3 to 4 decades, year after year, we have been increasing our balance of payment. And we have reached a stage that the country is bankrupt. But didn't any leader during the past so many decades understand that if we keep on borrowing and borrowing and borrowing without earning the foreign exchange, that going bankrupt is inevitable? How did the leaders miss that point? Not 1, not 2, not 3. So many people. So in the absence of that, we need to think of some strategy. We thought we need to change the leaders. We kept on changing people from A to B, B to C, C to D. But the country was going in the same down direction. I was wondering whether the Gamini Korea Foundation also could look into training the bureaucrats who are not going to change from an election. Bureaucrats will be there. If we can probably look at them and get these ideas into them, so they will be able to probably guide the politicians. So politicians come, and then instead of the bureaucrats just following what the politicians say, guide them in a way that things could happen. I experienced that in my organization. Now, I am an entrepreneur. I can take any decision in my companies if I want. But I have a set of good officers who guide me in my decisions. So it's very difficult for me to take a wrong decision because I have so many top people who will give me the right idea. So one way of looking at now, all what we said is true. This has to be done. But the challenge is how will we do it? Now, we as professionals will have to find a way to execute it. So my question from you is, give us some ideas, how can we execute this?
I give you time for one more. You wanted to speak, right? Yeah. Can you pass on the mic to that?
The President was saying it will take 25 years to
Thank you very much.
Can you answer my question?
Yeah, I just have one question. I see a slight conundrum or a fundamental issue in us moving towards the future, which is that Sri Lanka being a very small island nation, we have this issue of economy of scale when it comes to industrialization, where at most times we are outpriced by the larger players. Especially, I mean, when you take garments and almost all the industries that we play in. And as a result of which, we've been forced to sell commodities at commodity prices. One way out of that issue is to be more innovative in one's approach and look at differentiated products. But there, the issue is you need to be at the cutting edge of technology in order to compete with global giants. So in that context, I see this problem looming ahead of us, especially in time to come. Could you have any solutions or answers to that problem that Professor Howard, that you'd like to comment on?
This is regarding the development banking. I think Professor also here. Now, in this situation, long-term, low-cost funding, right? So would be a challenge. And I don't know whether even the current government has a policy on that. Is there any innovative way to, set up a development bank? Because I also agree that we need the development banking.
Yeah, adding just one point to what you said, we have limitations. one of the biggest limitations is the availability of raw material. So we have to be very careful if we are going to go to an industrial nation, country, we have to be very careful because I am an exporter. We produce hand-woven textiles for exports. We have to import our raw material, and at the end of the day, we have to compete with the person whom we are importing our yarn from. So we have that competitive disadvantage. And I think the garment industries, that gentleman said, the value addition is only 30%. So there is this issue, and also Sri Lanka has many strengths. I would say our agricultural-based industry or the economy, and also our biodiversity. So we have to be very careful in protecting that as well.
Yeah, my question is very simple. I just want to know the parameters. You have shown a graph where you have categorized industrialized countries and non-industrialized countries. I just want the parameters, how you categorized it. That's it. Thanks.
So, I'm sorry, I have seen several hands were going up, but I don't have time to allow all of you or even one of you. Let me give the chance to either Bram or Howard to respond to some of these questions. Yeah.
I think the gentleman has left now. He asked about how to get this started quickly. If he returns, I'll answer it. The parameters, what I took was any country that, so there were three conditions I had. The first was, remember that first graph where I was showing manufacturing as a percentage of GDP? My condition there was it had to be over 20%. Second condition, exports, manufacturers had to be more than 70%. Third condition, of exports, less than 30% had to come from garments and textiles. So that's where we filtered out the likes of Bangladesh and Morocco, who are focused mostly on garments and textiles, but not diversified, which is a condition we have for industrializing countries. So that's how we divided the two groups. Yeah, shall I? Okay. Well, of course, one aspect we always avoid, because unfortunately as economists we can't say much about it, except for that we do recognize this need for, let's say, more nationalist-oriented leaders that have the courage to go down this line of industrialization, because it's not an easy path. And I think we are well aware of President Premadasa's character. Definitely had its flaws, but no one can say that he wasn't determined. And I think that determination is what everyone is looking for in the leaders of today, but not finding, perhaps. So that is a frustration we recognize, but can't really give any advice on in terms of economics. But one thing I did want to mention is that what was incredible when I looked at that period from 1989 to 94, as someone pointed out once to Howard, actually the NDB got privatized even before President Chandrika Kumaratunga came to power. And it was during Premadasa's time. But this is actually a crucial point. See, President Premadasa worked with the IMF. He in fact got a loan from them in that period because he needed it. And he had to concede to privatizing the NDB. But what does he do? He doesn't listen to everything the IMF is telling him and, not think about an alternative strategy. He tries with the assets that he had at the time, which was still the DFCC and the EDB and the BOI, to keep the ship moving. And that for me was such an important lesson because, as Howard pointed out, that we recognize the nature of the IMF does not mean that you say, we don't want to work with you, end of story. You have to. You have to, and especially in times where there are no other options. But you have to find a way around it, which is incidentally what the Vietnamese did very well in 2006 when they also had to go to the IMF for a loan. But they went on that path of industrialization anyway afterwards and set up a development bank shortly after they took out the IMF loan. So I think that for me was an important lesson, and also that I was amazed at how fast President Premadasa turned things around by using the tools that he had at the time. But I'll stop there. Yeah, I didn't quite get that point, so maybe you can... Yeah. Mm.
Selling commodities as opposed to industrial products.
Yeah.
One way I see out of that issue is coming out with more innovative products, but there is another catch-22, which is the fact that you need to be at the cutting edge of technology, once again, in order to compete with global players. So I just wanted to pass this question on to you, whether there is any strategy one can invoke to get out of this issue of being constantly outpriced in almost every area that we sell in.
Yeah.
Over to you.
So I think there the example that I gave is an important one is Lodestar. Because remember that at that time, the giants that Sri Lanka was up against were China, Germany, US, and France. They were dominating the industry at the time, and they had those economies of scale you're talking about. But one very important thing that happened is, so Lodestar was actually a joint venture between the Jinnasena Group and a Belgian entrepreneur, Pringes. And he was crucial for the whole endeavor because what he brought to the table was the technology and know-how that he had acquired being in the industry for many decades. And he had the foreign market access as well. And those two elements were critical. And in fact, it's something similar that happened for Brandex when Martin Trust came and delivered those same things. And it's this that we're trying to highlight where, it doesn't have to be a foreign manufacturer that comes here and then the technology transfer happens. These individuals that somehow also have a love for Sri Lanka, they love to come here and they love apparently to work with Sri Lankan companies. But it's also an investment decision in the end. I mean, this is what Pringes saw is the capacity of Sri Lanka, the opportunity. And that, I think, was the important thing in terms of the technology. And then in terms of scale, you can see how it was overcome. Even though China obviously has that advantage by reducing the costs and getting into this niche area in quite a big way. I think that is one way to overcome that.
Michelin,
yeah,
together with another company in the big called Trelleborg, dominates the solid tire industry in the world.
Mm.
Yeah,
absolutely. And this is the sad thing, that it's now a foreign company, and Sorry. Yeah.
If I can just make one comment on what you said. Now, both those examples, there was an element of chance. Either Martin Trust came and brought the technology and the network, or the Pringes gave access to a level of technology to Sri Lanka. So I still see that perennial problem existing where Sri Lanka needs to identify cutting-edge areas that we should go into. That we have a strategic advantage, either natural resources or know-how. So for that, I think there's a role to be played by the government to identify specific areas and incentivize those specific areas for industrialization.
Absolutely. I mean, the examples of South Korea are incredible because, I mean, honestly, who has a comparative advantage in shipbuilding? And here South Korea comes along in the 70s, no know-how whatsoever in the area of shipbuilding, but the government identifies it as an area where they have an opportunity because a few of the large players were getting out of it, and this was a golden opportunity that they had identified. Provide all the right incentives, and then you can see how successful they were. So absolutely, and that's incidentally why we wanted Vagesha to say something about her area, because I think this renewables might be one of those areas where there is an opportunity for Sri Lanka.
There is the question about the EDB, no sorry, NDB, not the NDB, Development Bank problem generally. Howard wants to respond.
I'll respond, and then I'm going to ask Sunil to give the example he gave me about Canadian Development Bank. But I'll respond like this, that you can't really do development banking in the old way. There are lots of problems in terms of WTO regulation. Actually, I say this, but without proper knowledge in this area. I was just told this. However, what is a fact is that countries are now using lots of different vehicles to provide concessional financing. One is municipal authorities. Now, that is really big. For example, that's what China now uses, not, they don't use development banks. Well, they still use development banks, but for example, the EV funding and semiconductor funding has come largely through municipal authorities. These are not so easily traceable and blockable, as it were. But there are many other ways in which this concessional financing has been provided. I look at the Small Business Administration program in the United States. It's vast. It's absolutely vast. And it provides small and medium-scale companies with large amounts of startup money. One of those companies that got that money was Tesla. You know, so actually it's like an incubator, and it's not easily traceable. This is what is now very important, to know that there are no real barriers. The question is there the will to do this? That's really the question. Is there the will to do this? People say to me, no, it's actually about the money. Do we have the money available? I don't think so. I don't think that's really the problem. I think it's much more the will and the wherewithal to do that. And if, let's say, a government comes tomorrow and says, right, Howard, come with the suggestions, it wouldn't take us very long to come up with a comprehensive plan for concessional financing. I don't really see such a big problem. I mean, I'm not an expert in that area. But in this context, Sunil came with something quite fascinating, which I didn't know, and I still haven't read up on it, but maybe he can just say something.
Yeah, with regard to development banking, in the 1940s, Canada was an agricultural country, small population, and basically relied on the lumber industry. But they wanted to develop the industries, and they knew that the market was not going to do it. So what they did was, they formed the Industrial Development Bank as a subsidiary of the central bank, funded by the central bank, and within 10 years, they got the SMI industrial sector up, and believe me, there was hardly any inflation. So the problem is, with development banking and monetary financing, we have scaremongering going on, especially the right-wing propaganda tanks supporting the financial sector is carrying out a huge campaign against monetary financing. But monetary financing has, including the high-performing Asian economies, Japan, and now China, and even India to some extent, has been able to bring their economies to where it should be. But we have, the politicians also, some of them, what do they call it? Printing money, money printing. That's the word that they use. But actually, in today's context, it's not printed. There is a small amount of printing, but most of it is digitally done. But as long as we don't get over that problem and realize actually what monetary financing is, and if we are going to be controlled by the financial sector using the scaremongering tactics, because the crux of the problem is there. Financing industry successfully has been done by using monetary financing from the central bank. All the countries. No country has developed on the basis of free market economics.
Okay. I obviously have a few points to present here, but I'm going to close this discussion, please. Shall we postpone it to a private discussion later on, one-to-one? So I do not want to take any more of your time. Thank you very much for Howard asking me to chair this meeting. And it was very, very interesting listening to your presentation, the two of your presentation. All well-known points of view. We have talked about it, we have debated about it, and I myself have presented some of these ideas elsewhere. So there are also a few questions came up, like a development bank question, where I have something to contribute myself, but I do not want to take time. Thank you very much, all the panelists, for your presentations of complementary facts, not really asking questions about what Bram and Howard said, but things that could complement their points of view. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for all of you who have shown great interest in raising questions from the audience. With that, I'll request Mr. Fernando to close up the meeting with your maybe vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor W.D. Lakshman. And thank you everyone for being here with us for this 6th session of the Sri Lanka Innovators Forum. I hope you all enjoy today evening's deliberations. I would also like to thank our chairman, Dr. Lloyd Fernando, for helping us organize this event. I would like to thank especially Dr. Howard Nicholas and Bram Nicholas for taking up the challenge of delivering today evening's session. And I would like to thank Professor W.D. Lakshman and our esteemed panelists for taking their time off for being here with us. I hope they enjoyed the discussion. And last but not least, I would like to thank the organizers. I would like to thank our team who helped us to put all this together. And I would like to express my gratitude to all the participants who actively engaged in today's discussion for sharing their perspectives and raising important questions. In closing today's discussion, we have highlighted the importance of export-oriented industrialization in shaping our economic future. While challenges lie ahead, we are confident that through continued collaboration, discourse and innovative solutions, we can overcome these obstacles and achieve sustainable growth. Thank you once again for everyone involved in your valuable contributions and active participations. I hope you will please join our future sessions. We will keep you posted on them as well. And have a good evening. Tea will be served in the canteen. Thank you very much.